What's up, guys? It's Josh Lau here with the Card Guys, and today bringing you a little bit of unique content here on the channel. I've been getting a lot of messages about Dorinthea Iron Song in Classic Constructed, and people talking about how I approach different matchups, whether I think they're easy or hard, what cards do I sideboard, whether it's favorable or unfavorable. So I kind of thought I'd kind of take all those questions and make them into a video, so many people can learn about this. So as you can see here, I've made a chart because I'm part of the chart guys, right? We got two axes here. The x-axis here over on the left will be a matchup I considered easy to pilot. This means the sideboarding decisions are straightforward. This means the decision-making turn to turn is easy, and the overall strategy is not complicated to execute. On the right, we have matchups that I consider to be hard to pilot. These are matchups where you have to keep track of your resources very carefully. You have to, pitch threats back into your deck. You might have to pitch stack. You have to be very aware of the threats in your opponent's deck. And it's just a matchup where you have way less room to make any errors, right? All right. That is sometimes people consider, easy to pilot, hard to pilot. They misconstrue that and consider like, oh, if it's easy to pilot, it must be an easy matchup. Not the case. That's why we have two axes here. So the y-axis is whether or not I consider the matchup to be favorable or unfavorable. So if it's in the middle, I consider that 50-50. If it's toward the top, that's probably getting into the 80-20, maybe even higher. We'll kind of play that by ear. For the unfavorable matchups down on the bottom, those are going to be 20-80s, probably at the most extreme here. All right, so we have all 17 heroes here listed for Classic Constructed. Let's see how to do this. So for each matchup, I want to, put them on the chart. But I also want to go through important sideboard cards, or because I'm kind of building this as like a general. I should be very upfront. This is a Dawnblade focused Dorinthea deck, right? If you're playing axes or the saber dagger combo, not really a combo, but saber dagger style, this is not the video for that. This is strictly dealing with traditional Dawnblade Dorinthea with a couple of attack actions to supplement. This is not the Chonkinthea that I was building for Worlds. This is a fairly weapon-focused tier list here, okay? Also, I want to be clear that, even though I'm going to list out a lot of sideboard cards, obviously you can't include every sideboard card here that I'm going to list, but if you're having problems with particular matchups, you might want to include a couple extra copies of those sideboard cards, right? All right, I want to do this kind of in chronological order, because we can actually see how the game has progressed and how Dorinthea's matchups have progressed. Let's start off with Rhinar here. So Rhinar is, I guess, Dorinthea's classic opponent here. So this is a matchup that I consider slightly unfavorable. Back in the Crucible War days, this was one of the strongest decks against Dorinthea, because it kind of negated that end game plan that Dorinthea typically had, where you'd both be low on life, but very few D-reacts left, and then Dorinthea would take damage, go down to basically, low single digits, and then crack back and keep tempo the rest of the game, right? Rhinar kind of bypasses that because he can kill you when you're like less than 15. In addition, he got a bunch of new cards. So this, there's some very, very nutty lines that Rhinar can pull off these days. And, I think the new cards actually have benefited him slightly more than, Dorinthea's new cards have helped her. So a matchup that I would say was like 55% for Rhinar is probably closer to like 60% for Rhinar now. In terms of piloting, this is not a particularly hard matchup to pilot, mainly because you just make sure you run as few no blocks as you can. Your strategy is fairly simple. You're trying to execute have a blue, a threat, and a pump type of strategy. And when Rhinar goes for a tempo taking play with Intimidate or just whatever he has, there's really no counterplay. You just lay your hand out and say pick a card to intimidate. So oftentimes your plans get made for you in this matchup. So I would not consider this actually particularly difficult to pilot, especially in the grand scheme of things. So I'd put him, somewhere around here. Notable sideboard cards against Rhinar would include things like zero-cost D-Reacts. Oftentimes they can intimidate 3 cards, but they can't intimidate 4 cards without taking a risk or, lowering their damage output. So, or they just have to get lucky, right? So having a Sync Blow and Arsenal plus making sure that you have no blocks in your deck, you can always turn off Barraging Beatdown, which is a good chunk of damage. Other important sideboard cards would be, so I said that you don't want to really run no blocks, but I think 2 energy potions is pretty important, because if the Reinhardt's playing a more defensive style, kind of like doing his Bravo impersonation, you do need an energy potion to combo off or to execute a big turn to break through, right? And take tempo. So those are 2 cards that I would say would be helpful there. Yeah, so overall I'm going to put them, somewhere in this quadrant here. About there, seems about right. All right, next let's talk about Bravo. Bravo, this is, for those of you who know me, this is actually one of my favorite matchups in the game. This is a matchup that is pretty even. This is a matchup that is fairly skill intensive. I wouldn't say it's the most skill intensive thing in the world. You just have to make sure you have your shunts and you use them properly. But it is one of the most interactive matchups in the game. And I like interactive matchups in general, right? Okay, so important things for the Bravo matchup. So what makes this a little bit more difficult to pilot than the other ones is that the Bravo player could be trying to fatigue you. And if that's happening, you need to recognize that that's happening, and then you need to execute a counter strategy, which often involves a time snap potion and a energy potion, right? In addition to that, you need to use your Steel Blade shunts very carefully, because if you use them on things like, Spinal Crush, Crippling Crush, then you're not using them on the weapons, so you're missing out on value there. But if you don't have the D-React ready for, Crippling Crush, you could also lose a lot of tempo. So those are some things to consider. In terms of favorable or unfavorable, I think this is a pure skill-based matchup. The Bravo has tools to deal with you, and you have tools to deal with Bravo. Important things such as Route, Twinning Blade are really, really important. Potions, like I said, are very important. Other sideboard cards that are very useful, the shunts, obviously. Cards like Remembrance often make a big difference here, because getting to recycle 3 Warriors Valors when he's low on D-Reacts is also important. So important tips against Bravo is that you need to keep track of the amount of D-Reacts he has in his deck very carefully. You need to watch what he's pitching very carefully. And you need to adapt to the style of Bravo that you're playing against, whether it's more aggressive or more defensive, right? Anyways, I'd put him about here, 50-50 matchup that is a little bit on the harder side to play, but not outrageously hard. All right, next we have Katsu. So this is a little bit of a weird one to place, because we haven't seen Katsu part of the metagame for quite a while. In the past, this used to be ran as a, Kodachi control deck. And nowadays we are seeing a shift more towards you know, the tiger line, right? That is I would say that that is not particularly hard to play against. You have quite a bit of armor. You just have to be, you know, diligent with your blocks. And I would say in terms of in general, you're gonna have Dorinthea has a favorable matchup against ninjas because they have low armor, and generally they don't have a lot of D reacts in their deck, especially the current builds. So I'd say it, you know, slightly favorable here. In addition, you know, Warrior's one of the best blocking decks in terms of their armor and their, you know, their cards. So very, very unlikely for Katsu to actually get mass triggers off against you, even if they go, you know, really, really, really wide with an Art of War turn. So yeah, I'd put it as a favorable matchup, and I wouldn't say it's neither easy or hard to pilot against the deck. You're right. I would actually say it's actually maybe a little bit easier because this is the most classic of matchups. You attack at the correct times, you defend at the correct times, and you'll be fine, right? There's nothing particularly hard about this. You know, if you see, you know, Roar of the Tiger or whatever, it's time to block, right? If not, then you assess and move on, right? So I'd put him somewhere here. Important sideboard cards against Katsu. There isn't really any in particular. The main thing would be running Courage of Bladehold instead of Tunic. And if you're running Heart of Fendel, you'd probably take that out against Katsu because you're unlikely to be lower life than him. And no blocks sometimes get you in trouble against him. But I'd put him, you know, somewhere over there in that quadrant. All right, the final WTR here is the mirror. Obviously, this is neither favorable or unfavorable. We are going to assume that you are a high-level player playing against other high-level players, right? So obviously, it is not favorable or unfavorable. In terms of easy or hard to pilot, in the past, this would be, you know, somewhere around here near Bravo. It's still fairly difficult, but I would say, you know, it's a little bit easier than Bravo. This matchup has actually gotten a lot more volatile in the last couple sets. You know, it's possible for there to be a bit more high roll potential now, and you know, you could get blown out a little bit harder nowadays because of Glistening Steel Blade, Puncture, I guess Shatter if they're running that as well. So in the past, this used to be over here, but now I'd say, you know, it's a bit more like this right here. Okay, important cards for that matchup. Obviously, your shunts are very important. Again, this is a matchup that could go the distance, so a Remembrance would also be nice. But it is a no block, so there's that, right? This is a matchup where Command and Conquer is actually pretty strong, because, you know, of these decks, you know, the most valuable for these four heroes, like the Arsenal slot for Dorinthea is really, really important. So just in general, if you could attack their Arsenal slot, that's favorable for you. All right, let's move on to ARC. You know what? Let's talk about the Queens back-to-back. All right, so Dash. Another one of the classic matchups for those of you who've been around for a while. This is a matchup that, if your opponent is playing correctly, I think they have to go for the Induction Chamber, Plasma Purifier, 9D React style of Dash. I think if they try to race you with their, you know, their new cards like Pulse Wave Harpoon and other things like that, I think first of all, there's potential to fatigue the dash. You can already fatigue the dash in Blitz. It's actually much easier to fatigue dash in Classic Constructed. But in addition to that, I think you can actually race as Dory, because if they don't have D-Reacts because they're running Boost Dash, you actually have enough damage output and enough armor to get there fairly consistently. As for the Mechanoid style dash, could be okay, but then you have a lot of cards that don't block. And then if you include D-Reacts, it's possible that, you boost and you boost a D-React on your Mechanoid turn, so that could be a giant disaster there. So I think if you're playing against a high-level logical dash, they're going to be playing the control version of dash, right? And so with that, dash didn't get any new tools, whereas Dorinthea got new tools. So this used to be a fairly even matchup. However, I would say in the current state of things, I think this is actually slightly favorable. Things such as Iron Song Pride, extremely good against dash, because oftentimes that wastes one of their precious 9D reacts just to deal with your attack. This is a matchup that I would say right now is slightly favored towards Dorinthea, and I would say is about here in terms of difficulty to pilot. What makes this matchup a little bit difficult to pilot is that you're on a clock, so you can't just wait for the perfect hand, and you have to learn how to pilot various 5-card hands. And this is a matchup where, what you arsenal is quite important. So you're putting a threat into arsenal, putting a pump into arsenal changes your playstyle, right? This is a matchup where you're also going to be... You also need to use your equipment properly. You have to use things like Courage of Bladehold with the Refraction Bolters correctly. And it's a matchup that just tests your fundamentals. It's kind of a math game. You kind of look at, because oftentimes the dash is not going to have if they have enough items out that they're starting to attack you for 3 or 4, you probably have already lost. So you're basically not blocking their pistol shots early game, which basically means you gotta learn how to pilot different 5-card hands, like I said earlier. Important cards for the dash matchup. I would actually point out 2 that I think are pretty good. Plow Through. This is a card that's excellent against Guardians, Ninjas, and Dash, because a lot of their deck is attack actions, and that can really, really make things difficult for them. Because not only does Plow Through give that +1 bonus, but it gives it a +3 as well. So quite difficult for them to deal with. Another card that is pretty good, but very, very old school, but if dash becomes more prevalent, I might put this back into my deck, is Dauntless. Why is Dauntless good? Because it is painfully obvious when dash has a D-React. And all the D-Reacts that dash runs are generics. So Sink Below, Fate Foreseen, Unmovable. Moving Sink Below and Fate Foreseen from 0 to 1 cost means it requires 2 cards for them to use it. Sink Below plus a pitch, right? Unmovable goes from 3 to 4. Now it requires two more cards to play Unmovable, right? Or 1 more card to play Unmovable. So Dauntless is very, very backbreaking against Dash in particular. Also very good against defensive Katsu, but that doesn't exist anymore. So those are 2 cards that I think are really, really important. Obviously, you want your energy potions in this matchup as well, because executing a big turn with Courage of Bladehold is very, very, very important. All right, moving on, we have Viscerai. Of the Rune Blades, I'd say this is perhaps the more tricky one to approach. And I'd also say that this is probably the least favorable of the Runeblade matchups. I speak like there's many, but there's only 2 at the moment. Viscerai is a little bit more difficult for Dorinthea to deal with, mainly because Viscerai blocks pretty well, and if you're not presenting a big turn against Viscerai, he's very, very happy to play 2 cards, block with 2, play 2 with you. The 3-card hands for Viscerai are also very, very strong. So sometimes they can call your bluff and, block with 1 card if they have a D-React as well. And if you can't get through that, they've, they gain a lot of tempo there. And it only takes 1 or 2 times for that to happen for you to be in a lot of trouble as Dorinthea. So with that said, I would still say that this is slightly favorable for Dorinthea. Probably 55, 45 in your favor. Mainly because if they add D-Reacts to their deck, that messes up a lot of their ratios. And it's because they lost Scalata, their armor is actually not as high as it used to be. And they generally don't want to be using their armor to block unless it's really, really desperate situation. And because they don't run D-Reacts, you can kind of push them around as Dorinthea. Oftentimes, you just need to get over by 1. So things like singing Steelblade into Glint the Quicksilver is really, really powerful. That's not something you normally do against other opponents when you think they have a D-React, but bumping your attack by 1 is often all you need against Viscerai. And with that, you can get into a situation where you race with them pretty effectively. And yeah. All right, cards that are good against Viscerai in particular. So a old school card that I liked to use in the past was Sigil of Solace. This kind of, like, the rune chants are kind of difficult to block because if you give up your blue, first of all, you have to run AB1, which is already giving up, probably Crown of Providence or Skullcap. But also, you would only do that if you have 2 blues in your hand, right? And the rest of your hand made sense. And if you block the AB, you block the rune chants with AB, the Viscerai can actually change their plan and, create... They can actually dictate how you deal with their AB pretty well, or deal with their arcane damage pretty well. So in general, I'd say you don't actually want to be running AB1 against Viscerai or Briar. Especially Briar, you never run AB against them. But against Viscerai, depends on your deck build. But I found that Sigil Solace kind of acts as like a pseudo arcane barrier. If you're concerned about that. That also, Sigil Solace also causes the game to go longer, which in theory is better for Dorinthea. Because as soon as the Viscerai player loses his armor, it's pretty easy pickings. Other cards that are notably strong, not really any that are jumping out to mind. This is definitely a matchup where you want to keep your no blocks to a minimum. I'd say you might even cut your E-Pots because the game is going to be pretty quick, generally. Back when Viscerai used to be able to play 2 styles, this was a little bit harder because you didn't know which style you were going to be facing. But now all the Viscerais are, fairly aggro, Mauve, Shrill, Rosetta style. So they're fairly easy to predict, and as such, I think, it's slightly favored. In terms of piloting difficulty, I would say this is fairly straightforward on how to do this. You're playing against an opponent that has some 2 blocks, has some 3 blocks, probably has no D-Reacts, has medium to low armor, and so it should be fairly straightforward on which hands to go with and which hands to not go with. As such, I'd put him, somewhere over here. All right, moving on to Azalea. Azalea is, admittedly, I have not played against this a lot, but the few games that I have played against Azalea, the Steelblade Shunts are just massive against this deck, and if you can return damage, so if you can block for 3 and then shunt for 6, that generally shuts their turn down. And if you could return damage against Azalea, she probably can't stop it very easily. If she blocks with her arrows, which block for 3, She doesn't have arrows to send back at you. If she blocks with her non-attacks, they generally block for 2, except things like knock the death whistle and stuff like that. But so she doesn't block particularly well. If they're running D-reacts, that's really, really awkward for them in general. Take cover is okay, I guess, but it's just not easy for Azalea to deal with warrior in general. And likewise with like Azalea and Lexi, they both just they just don't operate well against a deck that is threatening attack reactions, just because of the nature of their cards. As such, this is a favorable matchup. In terms of piloting difficulty, if you know the Azalea's card pool, this is more on the easy side. If you don't, this is going to be on the harder side. So, important cards against Azalea, you would bring in your Shunts, and you would bring in your Tunic, obviously. And this is a matchup where you might not get reprise as often as you want, so you would probably cut an Iron Song response, probably cut an Overpower. You don't actually need to go, huge over their attacks, because if they're blocking you, they're probably laying their whole hand down. Because an Azalea with, 1-2 cards is not really getting the job done. As such, this is I would say, as long as you're kind of aware that some of the on-hits are kind of detrimental to you, and especially if you get caught off guard with that as Shunt, I think the matchup will be fairly straightforward for you and fairly favorable. So I put this, somewhere over here. All right, we got one more ARC hero, and that is Kano. So this is going to be somewhere over here, mainly because if you're playing AB3 bolters, each attack has such a large threat to them, especially with 30 life. Especially considering Kano probably isn't running D-reacts, because that messes up his hero ability. In Blitz, in the old school Blitz, they were able to, do things with Fork Lightning, but in Classic Constructed, your life is so high that they basically have to go for something with Blazing Aether. As such, it is very, very easy to counter what they're doing with a single Oasis Respite. Oasis is so good against Kano that I think actually the Kano decks have to run things like Imperial Warhorn or Imperial Decree. I think it's Imperial Edict is the one where they play that and they say you cannot play Oasis this turn. Because if you Oasis their Wildfire, their turn falls apart. So the only thing that's tricky about this matchup is that you have to be kind of patient with how you use it, because sometimes they can try to bait you into using your Oasis, right? So I would say that's pretty much the only other thing. Also, knowing when to AB things, I guess things like Aether Spindle in general, you want to kind of deny that, especially because if they Crucible into Aether Spindle, they get to opt 5, which means they get to set up their hand, and their next Kano activation is not blind, assuming they top all the cards, right? So just, understanding, blocking Lesson and Lava, stuff like that. There's some nuance to that, but in general, I'd still say this is a fairly favorable matchup for Dorinthea. I guess this is, it's not a super 80-20 matchup, but I'd say, this is a comfortable 65 or 70% matchup. It's very possible for you to stumble a little bit, like if you don't draw a hand with a blue, or you don't draw an Oasis fast enough. That would be, pretty bad. Good cards against Kano. Obviously, the red Oasis would be good. The yellow Oasis is not bad either. Sometimes I like to run 3 red, 1 yellow. That's, you know, that just messes with their head a little bit, especially if you use the yellow on one of their earlier things. Like yellow Oasis with just a little bit of AB can take care of basically everything that they're doing. Because that's the yellow Oasis is 3, and then you AB 2. 5 takes care of almost every on hit in the game. Yeah, and I think if the Kano tries to drag the game out longer, tries to set up more, your deck just in general can punch through quick enough. Even though you don't have the armor to supplement your offense, I think you're still in a good position. As such, I would put them there. All right, we have our WTR ARC heroes complete. Let's move on to the Monarch heroes. All right, let's start with our boy Boltyn here. I am going to be fairly biased, I think. I'll try to be objective here. Because if the Dorinthea player understands what the Boltyn player is trying to do, this is quite difficult for Boltyn. Luckily, from my experience playing Boltyn against Dory, it's not too bad for Boltyn. But I think in theory, it can be quite bad for Boltyn. So talk about this matchup a little bit. So Boltyn basically has to play Saber combo against Dorinthea, mainly because you're never going to get any help when you're playing Raiden, which means you're going to have to get an early Spirit of Arena out, or you're going to have to always have a Beacon or Courageous Steel Hand or Take Flight in order to do anything against Dorinthea. Because she's never blocking with attack actions against your deck. The other thing that's really, really bad for Boltyn in this matchup is that Dorinthea can clean block your combo really, really easily. Crowd of Providence plus a card. Courage of Bladehold plus a card. Brave Forge Bracers plus a card. Really, really, really smooth block of your combo, which means you're going to end your combo probably with the same amount of soul, and you dealt probably 10 damage to them, and now you have to finish the game. So that's not easy. Another thing is that it's probably possible for Dorinthea to fatigue Boltyn if you just let one damage hit, especially if they're going for a triple Lumina. If you just Dorinthea is probably one of the few heroes that actually can survive a triple Lumina combo. Or let's assume this is a double Lumina combo. If you just let a little bit of damage in, especially if it took them a while to find their combo, it's possible for Dory to just run the Boltyn out of threats, because this is a matchup Boltyn is probably not playing Remembrance in. Yeah, so as such, I think this is actually a favorable matchup for Dorinthea. And piloting difficulty, this is not very difficult to pilot at all. This is the main. I guess the main thing would be to understand the game plan of the Boltyn and how it interacts with your game plan. You're basically just playing 5-card hands until the Boltyn combos. You have to be aware of things like Soul Shield and Sink Below Fate Foreseen. They're obviously going to be played against you. Yep. And just using your armor on their combo turn is something that I can just tell you to do, and now you know it instead of having to figure it out yourself. As such, I'd put him somewhere over there. All right, the other legal Monarch hero is Levia. Levia, this is a hero that I don't have a lot of experience with in Classic Constructed, but I have played against this in Blitz a fair amount. This is a matchup where you should be fairly favored, but this is a matchup that you could get caught off guard a little bit if you're not aware of, you know, the lines of play that Levia can take. And I think most people, even high-level players that have played a lot, are not really aware of the lines that Levia can take. As such, you know, I'm not going to put this super far into the favorable matchup, because the damage output of Levia is actually pretty high. And if you get on the back foot, I don't actually think you have much pivot potential. Mainly because your first pivot they can block with the Husk, and then the second pivot they can basically just take. with their life total. So to get to a point where you actually have to force the Levia to block, it takes a while to do that. The best way to get back if you're on the back foot, I guess, is just to defend and wait for them to roll scabs and fail. So I guess that could happen. In terms of the new cards, Levia got a few, like there's a few cards in the new set that are decent for her. But in general, I think this is a matchup, that is not going to be too difficult. But I would say it's, a little bit on the harder side to pilot because how your deck interacts with theirs is not going to be very obvious because it's going to be, you have to play it, from game to game. Depends on, what's in their graveyard, what hands you draw, what hands they're attacking you with, what the life total is like. So it's not super obvious what to do. Oh, I forgot to talk about, cards that are good and bad for these matchups. So for Boltyn, you probably don't want to be running any attack actions unless you have CNC Pummel. And against Boltyn, you would probably want to reduce the number of no blocks in your hand as low as possible so you can block on their combo turn. Against Levia, honestly, I just haven't played this matchup enough to know what is really, really good against them. Traditionally, when you take a turn against them, if they're not interested in blocking, you're never going to get reprised. So I would be a little bit wary against, the third copy of Iron Song response. A little bit wary for playing Overpower in this matchup as well. Because once they start, putting cards into their banish zone with Blood Debt, they're basically not going to block. So you probably need to be very, very careful of how many reprise dependent cards you're running. All right, so that is that. All right, so we are done with Monarch. Let's move on to Tales of Aria. All right, Briar, the other rune blade in the room. So this is a bit easier than Viscerai, but I would say this is a matchup where if you pick the wrong 5-card hand to go with, you probably will lose. So what keeps this matchup, not a huge favorite for Dory, I'd say it's a little bit more favorable than Briar, is because I'm actually gonna, like, it's hard to find in the room there, but he goes somewhere like here, I guess. I'll put them there. The Briar matchup is difficult because if the Briar player finds Channel Mount Heroic before you find a suitable 5-card hand, you're probably playing from the back foot, and then you have to make a decision on how to get back into the game. If both players are, running fairly smoothly, I'd say this is in your favor because, again, D-reacts are very, very detrimental to Runeblade's game plan in general. This is even more so for Briar because she wants a, even mix of attack actions and non-attack actions, because if Briar draws a hand with no attack actions, which non-attack actions and D-reacts are, her turn shuts down. So even with full tempo, Briar can still stumble like that. Notable cards for this matchup include, so generally Briar's coming in with a lot of breakpoint attacks, and if you can run a few Sink Belows or Fate Foreseens, those would be nice, especially on your key turns. Denying them an embodiment is pretty key to having a big turn. So oftentimes you would use your armor when you want to go for a big turn against them. If you anticipate their turn as just, Ravel, like Nimblism, Rabble into Rosetta Thorn with Tunic, you can, use a card plus your armor, block for 7, take the Rosetta Thorn damage, and then crack back when they don't have a embodiment of Earth. Other than that, fairly straightforward matchup, fairly quick matchup, a slightly favorable matchup in general, I'd say. All right, next. Oh boy. This is probably the hero that I get the most questions about. Um, let me start off by saying that Oldhim can be built in a way in which you cannot win. However, the forces of the metagame keep that style of Oldhim in check. Because if fatigue him is a thing, things like Icelander, Dromai, even Dash, Bravo, these decks will jump in and, keep that in check. So we have to say a thank you to Icelander, Dromai, Dash, and Bravo for keeping that super fatigue style Oldhim in check. But it is very, very possible for them to build their deck so that you cannot win. I'm not going to talk about that situation because if you're coming against a player that, stuffs his deck with 18D reacts, he wins against you, but auto loses the other matchups. So it is what it is, right? We're talking about the more classic Oldhim, the one that has pummels, has some, rouse the agents, has a couple staunches in the side, maybe has a sink below or two. We're talking about that type of Oldhim, the one that's probably running 6 Earth cards, not like fairly ice focused, right? So that type of Oldhim obviously is very difficult to pilot, and it's obviously still unfavorable, right? But to what degree? Let's talk about that. All right. So what makes this matchup unfavorable? First of all, Rampart of the Ram's Head is ridiculous because it blocks for 2 with no reprise with the Crown of Seeds, right? It also ensures that their deck thickness is always thicker than ours. And this is a hero that, a single Frostbite is actually fairly disruptive to our deck, right? So in order to deal with Oldhim, you actually have to devote quite a few sideboard slots to them. Obviously, things like Steelblade Shunt pulling extra duty here against Oldhim because not only does it deal a damage to him, it also saves your Frostbite. And if they decide to pummel it, it also could cover up some of the pummel damage as well, right? If a red Steelblade Shunt actually covers up a blue pummel on a Winter's Wail perfectly, right? In addition to that, cards like Remembrance obviously going to be very, very important in this deck against Oldhim. Things like Heart of Fendel going to be very important because it's possible that you are lower life than them while you're trying to set up. Speaking of setup, things like Time Snap Potion, Energy Potion, obviously going to be very important against Oldhim because if you are playing with Shunts, you're playing with Tunic, which means you're not playing with Courage, which means in order to have a big turn against Oldhim, which, spoiler alert, you need to have big turns against Oldhim, require you to have an Energy Potion. Lastly, cards like Plow Through, very nice against Oldhim. And just in general, the bigger attack reactions are also good. Overpower and Rout are quite good. Cards that are not so good against Oldhim are cards like Ironsong Pride. That's a card that's rarely going to get value against an Oldhim because they could block Exact and then Crown for that extra 1, or they could block Exact and then you play that and then they go with the Earth React. Yep. So in general, that's what makes this matchup difficult. Those are the sideboard cards that are important. The reason that this is, so hard to pilot, I'm going to put it way over here actually, is this is the matchup that actually tests whether or not you know how to play Dorinthea or not the most. All these heroes here, you just look at your hand and say, sweet, this hand does something. So let's attack, right? Or, it could be better, but you know what? I have full tempo against the Boltyn. I have full tempo. I've the Katsu player had an off turn. I have full tempo, right? So, a lot of the times it's fairly easy to just look at your hand and just play it out, right? But if you look at your hand and just play it out, turn to turn to turn to turn to turn, the Oldhim player is going to fatigue you out of threats. And I'm not even talking about fatigue him, like the 18D react Oldhim deck. A normal Oldhim with 3 Staunch, 3 Sink, and 6 Earth cards can fatigue you if you don't play correctly against them. Also, dealing with Pummel is also a little bit difficult for some players to deal with. Oftentimes, if the Oldhim wants to pummel me, that means he probably took some damage to do that. So just saying, all right, you want to pummel me? That's fine. You lost 5 life to pummel me. That's fine. Pummel me. I'll lose a card. I'll get an on hit. I'll get a frostbite, whatever. And move on, right? So this is something that's a little bit difficult. They're like, oh, he's going to pummel me. I got to overblock. Or I got to use my shunt on that, right? If you could use your shunt on that, that's okay, I think. But actually, the shunts get more value if you actually are shunting the Winter's Wail. In addition to that, learning how to play against the Ice React is a little bit tricky, because sometimes you want to, play something and then CNC them, right? That's actually not really what you want to do. So we've covered a lot of things regarding Oldhim, but I think the main thing to understand is that if you have the chance to block or take damage and hit him back, generally you want to take damage and hit him back, because you have a very limited number of threats in your deck, and as soon as you get to a point where you're out of threats, you probably can't deal more than like 5 damage to him once you start running out of your reds. So very important. You also need to be very mindful of your key cards like Twinning Blade, Singing Steel Blade. These are cards that need to be pitched back into your deck if possible, and these are cards that you need to keep a very close eye on in general. All right, let's move on to Lexi Livewire. This is a matchup that I consider to be decently good for us. In general, the Rangers have a little bit of a difficult time because of the demands placed by their deck to have enough arrows and to have some non-attacks, and their good blocking cards are their arrows, and Rangers, just like ninjas, have very low armor. So I'd say it's, moderately favorable for us, but this is actually one of the more tricky matchups to pilot, because how to defend against Lexi is not so obvious because they can go a little bit wider. They also could be playing the Death Dealer Lexi, which is a deck that really taxes your resources. So this is a matchup, just like all the ice matchups, this is a matchup where you need to bring in a few extra blues if you have them from your sideboard. And this is a matchup where, now it's a double-edged sword here, because the blues, like Energy Potion, Time Snap Potion, such like that, actually become very difficult to actually play, because a single Frostbite makes it really tough for you. This is actually a matchup where, based on how the game is going, you need to determine probably in the first 5 turns or so if you're going to try to fatigue the Lexi or you're going to try to win with conventional means. In general, this is a matchup where you have to go with plan A or plan B. You cannot switch that easily, and you have to make that decision fairly early. So that is actually what makes this matchup a little bit harder to pilot, is because based on the equipment they flip up, and based on how the first few turns go, how their first Rain Razor's turn goes, you need to identify whether or not you can do that or not. So against the Death Dealer Lexi, that's much harder because they have Dominate to push through arrows. But if you know that they're kind of on the Death Dealer Lexi plan, you might want to play with the shunts and go for fatigue from there. But against an unknown Lexi, that's pretty risky. You would generally just try to run a more mid-range Dorinthea strategy with a few extra blues. Okay, so like I said, I think this is slightly favorable for us, probably 55-45. Depending on the build. If you actually know what build they're on, it's much easier to play against them. But it's also one of the more tricky matchups to pilot, and it's a matchup that you can kind of mess up if you're not careful, right? All right, moving on to the Uprising Heroes. Icelander Stormbind. This is a pretty tricky deck to play against, and that is because you have to change change how you play the game. You can no longer go Warrior's Valor, Sharpened Steel, Swing, because you're going to get a Frostbite and your turn is going to end. Or they're going to evaluate that, oh, this is a very, very dangerous turn. Let's really put on the disruption here. This is a matchup that is obviously going to be hard to pilot against, and I'd say this is actually slightly unfavorable for us, mainly because they attack you from two different directions, and you have to be very cognizant of the types of disruption that they have. So things like Hypothermia, Blizzard, Channel Lake Frigid, Arctic Incarceration, these are all very, very tough things for us to deal with as a Dorinthea. One, Frostbite often messes up our cost curve, and two, probably shuts down any chance of us swinging twice. As such, this is actually a matchup where I think, because the difficulty in swinging twice is so high, this is actually a matchup where you probably want to bring in Jubil. I haven't tested it quite enough to know if that's correct or not, but my gut says that because if you actually get to attack twice against Icelander, that probably means they kept their cards and they're trying to swing tempo back, so you're never going to be able to keep your counter on the Dawnblade, which means you didn't actually gain any bonus from hitting twice and getting a +1 counter on that, right? Whereas the threat of Jubil is every single time you hit, you get assuming you don't have a Spellbane Aegis token, you get one, which gives you Spell Void 1. And this actually, allows for things like Tunic, Red Oasis, plus the Spell Void 1 to block a red Aether Ice Vein. And I think that's, indirectly healing 1 is probably better than the possibility for 1 or 2 extra damage the following turn. Just because of how the turn cycles operate in this game. So yeah, I'd say this is definitely hard to pilot, definitely slightly unfavorable for us, probably 40-60 in the towards the Icelander there. And cards that are very important against this deck are obviously things like Oasis Respite, and you actually may consider cards like Remembrance against them. If the game goes very, very long, that could be very, very useful. This is often a deck where you have to kind of feel out what they're doing. Most decks nowadays are fairly homogenized, so you basically can put them on like 6D reacts, 6 to 12 attack action cards, and Frost Hex, right? So given that, if they're playing like that, you can kind of develop a strategy for that. But if they're playing something a little bit off the wall, or they're playing more arcane focus, less physical focus, you got to kind of change your game plan, and that's something that'll just come with time. If you played against enough Icelanders, you've kind of picked up on who's doing kind of the normal Icelander thing, the Bull-lander style, and who's playing a little bit more off the wall, right? All right. That's that. Let's move on. Dromai. This is a deck that, assuming that the Dromai player knows what they're doing, this is probably pretty difficult. This is probably somewhere around here, I would say. Maybe here. This is another 40-60 matchup. What makes this so difficult is, if they know how to play this matchup, it's difficult. So what do I mean by know how to play this matchup? If they never present large dragons for you to kill, if they focus on the baby dragons, you're going to have a tough time. if they know how to abuse the fact that you probably only have 3, 4, maybe 5 poppers in your deck, you're going to have a hard time having a decent turn cycle, right? Because if they can 2-card 7 you, 2-card 8 you, whatever, it's very unlikely that you can strike back for an equal amount of damage if they block, right? And finally, the Dromai player also has access to D-Reacts, things like Sigil, can already put you on the back foot from turn 0. And if they get an early rake off, you're kind of in trouble there. If they do not play properly, though, this is fairly straightforward on what to do. You mop up the dragons for 5-6 turns, and then you go after the Dromai player, right? This is probably not a matchup you can fatigue them. Haven't attempted it, but my gut feeling says that's probably not possible. And if you get a swarm of baby dragons, your deck just doesn't efficiently deal with them, because the things that give go again generally give a buff to the attack, right? So you don't want to be wasting it like that. And the Dromai player can get the board state to a position where it's kind of like Prism. So that's kind of difficult to deal with. Also, cards like Tumultai can destroy important pieces of equipment. Whether you're running the Tunic or you're running the Courage Blade Hold, those are very, very high priority targets there. And it just feels like you're going to have to pilot this very, very carefully, because based on the style of their deck, you kind of have to change, and how they're playing dictates how you should be playing, right? And so when you have such a complicated interaction like that, there's lots of permutations, and so it's gonna be difficult, right? All right. Next up, we got Fai. Fai Rising Rebellion. This is a hero. Overall, this is definitely a favorable matchup. Why is this favorable? Fai can't block for shit, and if they're running any D-Reacts, they're running 3 copies of That's All You Got, which is actually for their mirror. And their armor can be used a few times, but generally, if you have a big turn as Dorinthea, you don't even need a big turn. A medium turn as Dorinthea is not going to be stopped by the Fai's armor, right? So they have to give you reprise, or they just have to take it, right? So I would say it's a very, very difficult matchup for Fai to deal with. Your damage output is very, very high, and you could actually get to a point when you have 2 or 3 counters on the weapon, and then you can go block for 2, pitch, swing. They either have to give you their whole hand, or they block Xaxes and you come over with a pump, retain the counter until they brick on a turn. The Fai deck also has several no blocks in their deck, like Art of War, and almost their whole deck is blocking for 2. There's some 3 blocks in there, but they're generally their resource cards, so they don't want to be blocking with those. As such, fairly favorable for us. In terms of difficulty, the only difficult part about dealing with Fai is learning how to use your armor correctly, on how to deny a... If they're going MOM, I think that's actually wrong, so they're probably playing the Pouncing Lynx. So you have to know when to block to deny either Assault the Wound Search, or just deny the Assault the Wound from being large, right? And so you have to learn how to use your armor properly, but that's a thing that you have to do in general. The speed at which Fai can just, output damage is pretty crazy. So you actually probably will have to play some of the matches from behind. So as such, I would put him, somewhere over here, maybe somewhere over here, I guess. Probably equal with Katsu, but a little bit more complicated, because the defense of a Fai attack pattern is a little bit harder to deal with. All right, finally, we have Arakni. So this hero is actually very ineffective against your hero, against Dorinthea, because The spider bites don't impact the way you defend, and things like attack the armed don't do anything against your deck either. So they have a lot of cards that just don't operate very well. Things like just in general, their whole attack action package is not very effective against your deck. So I would say that makes the matchup more favorable for us. And in terms of difficulty of piloting, this is a deck that probably is not that hard to pilot against. I would probably put it somewhere around here, mainly because this is a deck that there isn't enough cards in the current pool for this to really I think be top tier. And the armor for Arakni is actually fairly low, even if they're able to cycle their cards effectively. They still have to give you reprise basically every single time they want to block. They do run quite a few D-Reacts generally, and it's possible for them to run you out of threats, if you're not playing sharply. But I think in general, most Dorinthea players are not going to have an issue with dealing with Arakni. All right. As such, I think we've come to the end of this video. I feel pretty happy with where we got all of these positioned. As you can see, I think Dorinthea has quite a few good matchups. And the common theme among these is that they have low armor, or they have no D-Reacts or very few D-Reacts, or we can exert so much pressure on them, namely, Kano and Levia, that, their rope runs really short, right? Heroes that are more difficult to deal with, oftentimes, either have mechanics that kind of, jump over our mechanic, like Rhinar's could just intimidate the cards that we wanted to block with, and now we have to play a very awkward game. Or they, they're a little off the wall, like Dromai, presenting a board state. But in general, what makes life really hard for Dorinthea is frostbites and disruption. And, if you want to tune your deck to be better against Icelander and Oldhim, you can up your blue count. That's the first thing. So back in the Crucible War days, you could be running as few as 16 blues. But in the current metagame, I'd say you generally run around 21 would be good. Maybe going up 22, 23 in those ice matchups. And another thing that you can do to make your deck better against these two would be, having Shunt against Oldhim and having Oasis against Icelander. I would also say these are two matchups that are much lower if you have not had sufficient reps against these decks. If you've played enough against these two heroes, I think you learn how to deal with them a little bit better, just in general, and you'll figure out kind of intuitively what works and what doesn't work, right? Whereas with Rhinar and Dromai, I don't actually think, even if you play a lot of games against them, I don't actually think it'll get much easier, right? They kind of just are here and they don't really move. Whereas these two, they would actually be down here for people that haven't played much. But I think they'd come up to here if you have enough experience. All right, so I think that's going to wrap up things. This has been Josh Law with TheCardGuyz. If you have any questions, please leave them in the video description, or you can message me on Discord or DM me on Twitter or whatever. All right, I hope you're having a good day. See ya. Take care.